Welcome to On the Money. I'm Mark Hamrick. We are so happy to be joined today by the author of the three-book series, Broke Millennial. Her name is Erin Lowry, and she has her brand new book available right now called Broke Millennial Talks Money. I have to tell you, this is a fantastic book. We're going to talk about this and so much more. Erin, thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful to be here.
Congratulations on the book. And let me just ask you, first of all, how did you come up with this idea of this broke millennial concept or brand upon which you base so much writing now?
I felt broke, I think is the number one answer. And truly, there's an origin story that really is derived in the fact that I grew up in a household where we talked about money very openly. It wasn't a source of tension. It was a very common conversation. And what you grew up around is normal. And then you go to college and you just kind of don't talk about money a lot in college. It didn't start to really come up until senior year when that imminent being thrust into the real world scenario was going to happen. And then my first year in New York, I was working as a page for the Late Show with David Letterman. I also worked as a barista and I was also a babysitter. So I was hustling, working all of these jobs, living in New York, trying to make ends meet. And I was earning about $23,000 that year. Yeah, I felt pretty broke. But I also felt really in control. And it quickly became apparent that a lot of my friends were not in that same position. They were either being financially supported by their parents or they just got completely overwhelmed by money. And that really started to get my interest. And eventually I reached a point where a girlfriend of mine at the time was working at a job that she absolutely hated. She had moved to New York to be an actress, very common story. And I was asking her, like, well, why don't you just get a job that gives you the flexibility to go out on auditions? We were 23 at the time. She had no student loans. She had no credit card debt. Her parents were already providing some level of support. Felt like the time, if there was ever going to be one, to go take that risk. And she looked at me and she said, I just don't like thinking about money. All I do is hope I have enough at the end of the month. And that for me was a light bulb moment. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but I mean that in a way of all of a sudden it clicked how many people felt that uncomfortable, and people who had a lot of privilege feeling really uncomfortable about money. And that to me was the inspiration behind everything that I do with Broke Millennial, is this idea of, I just want you to talk about it. I just want you to feel in control of it. It doesn't matter how much or how little you're making, you can be in control. And that was really what inspired it all.
Well, you're a very good writer, and that's one of the things I love about the book is it's a pleasure to read, aside from the fact that there's so much valuable information. And I know this isn't going to blow your mind exactly, but I am not a millennial. But there was a lot in the book that really resonated with me. And by way of background, I grew up as a child of two parents who had hailed from Appalachia. And personal finance was not something that was among their strengths. I think I did develop an appreciation for hard work. I was working at a radio station when I was 15, probably violating federal minimum wage laws at the time, but nobody cared. But my point is that leading to the subject of the book, your whole idea about we need to do better about talking about money. And I love how you break it down at work, with friends, with family, and essentially, I think you use the phrase romantic partners. So that could be the person one is dating, or in my case, married to for 30 plus years. Why is it, do you think, as a society, and I don't know if this is global, you tell me what you think. I feel like as a society, we are lousy at having these conversations. And that's on a personal basis as well as a whole.
I agree. I do think it's really hard for people to engage in financial conversations in a way that's direct. I do think we're often talking about money, but we're just using more coded language around maybe what we can and can't afford, or what we do and don't value. And that could be as simple, and I think kind of a classic example is, in non-pandemic times, being at a cocktail party, for instance, and having a conversation with somebody who's in perhaps family planning stage of life. And there might be a comment about, oh, we're waiting to have our second until our first goes to kindergarten. That's actually a money conversation around, we don't want to have to pay for daycare for two kids, so we're waiting until one goes to school and then we only have to pay for one. But that's not what we're saying out loud. I think so much of this, though, is about shame and judgment. It's us being afraid of being judged by people who we respect, who we want admiration from, who we love. And we are often comfortable having very naturally uncomfortable conversations with total strangers. There are many conversations I've gotten into on airplanes that I don't think that person, if they actually knew me, would have disclosed that level of information. But who am I to them? They're probably never going to see me again. So it's a safe space. But when you think about being vulnerable with somebody that you're close to, you're now risking a judgment factor. And that's why we often get very quiet when it comes to our finances. And that could be not just because we're embarrassed that maybe we've made a mistake. It could also be that we don't want to be judged about an amount that we do have. So it works both ways.
Obviously, millennials now are among those who've experienced two dramatic economic downturns. We have the sense that we're emerging from the most recent one, which was the worst since the Great Depression. And obviously, broadly, this has set young workers, young people back, perhaps more than others, because they are as much in these sectors of the economy that saw heightened levels of unemployment. First of all, what's your just reaction to having experienced this in the sense of perhaps actionable advice for people who are looking to claw their way back? And the second question really is, I heard stories about people who had survived the Great Depression and how they changed their money management practices for the rest of their lives. How do you think this will affect millennials for the rest of their lives?
To merge the two, for me, my big concern for millennials is investing. And that both recessions are going to make people really nervous about investing in the stock market. And whether that's because 2008, we saw it take a huge tumble. And then, if you were in, or if you started to buy in, you experienced one of the greatest bull markets in the history of the stock market. But for so many people, whether it was their parents seeing retirement portfolios decimated for a period of time, perhaps having a knee-jerk reaction and cashing out, and therefore losing out on the return, or they themselves had maybe just started to invest and then saw it bottom out, people got really nervous. Now you have the pandemic where the economy and the stock market are two separate entities. We often conflate them. The stock market was acting all sorts of crazy all the way through this pandemic. And for some people, it got them interested. But for others, it made them very nervous, or they, through no fault of their own, had absolutely no money that could go into the stock market during this time. And it could take years to build a financial stability that they need to really have put on their financial oxygen mask and be ready to invest, at least outside of retirement. At the bare minimum, my big push for millennials is that we do remember and reframe that investing through a 401k or through an IRA is investing. You are an investor, assuming you pick investments and it's not sitting in cash, and that is step one. You don't have to necessarily be investing in taxable accounts, at least not right now, but do something to make your money be growing and compounding for you. It does make me a little nervous that, particularly after the pandemic, people are going to really want to be more hoarding cash, being a bit more conservative. I know I myself am definitely more conservative about how much I want in an emergency fund. That traditional advice of 6 months, or like 7 months out of that 6-month amount being enough to get you through if your industry shuttered in the beginning of this pandemic. Living in New York, not that far from Broadway, I know people personally who have been out of work since March of 2020 with right now still no conclusive date of when they're going to return. So they could have done everything right and still have their entire financial house have been turned upside down through absolutely no personal culpability, no fault of their own.
There's been a lot of discussion lately, as you know, about the so-called democratization of the stock market. And there's been a lot of volatility in stocks. Even as we're speaking today, we've seen some of that. Is that would-be dam breaking in the sense of more young people are getting involved with the market? And is there too much short-term gamesmanship, for lack of a better way of putting it, going on here, where people aren't thinking about the long game, which is the most important aspect, as you say, to save for retirement?
That's such a hard question to answer right now, because that hindsight will be 2020, obviously, and perhaps years from now. I do certainly get nervous that maybe people are considering the stock market a bit too gamified at this point. They are thinking very short term, whether we're looking at GameStop or whether we're looking at, the whole meme stocks idea, or whether we're looking at sort of whether it's cryptocurrency or any derivation of. On the flip side, the thing that I do get excited about is that people are interested. And I do like that it is forcing people in different ways to start to educate themselves. Now, I'm hoping that if you're educating yourself through experience, by that I mean actually investing with your money, you're only doing it with a small amount, an amount that you could comfortably lose, and it's not going to devastate your overall financial picture. But there's part of me that is encouraged that there are ways that people are getting excited, getting interested in, and starting to research.
As we prepare to bring this plane in for a landing here in the coming minutes, I do want to talk in a moment about one hot money topic, and that is cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin. This is such an area of controversy right now. You have some traditional money shops or banks sort of talking them up, or at least trying to be in the market to give people access for these things. I'm wondering what your feeling about this growing area of interest is.
When it comes to cryptocurrency, first and foremost, definitely not an expert in this area, doing a lot of trying to learn myself. But I certainly think blockchain at the very least, and then some form of cryptocurrency on top of that, is here to stay. So it is important for all of us to start to learn what that means, what that will mean for the future. However, I'm not so bullish that I think you should be dumping huge quantities of your investment portfolio into what is still essentially an untested asset class. So it is really important that if you are interested, if you want to learn, if you want to be investing that way, that you do make sure it is not all of your money, at least for right now. Plus, it never should be. You should always be diversified. Another thing to consider. But I really do see, obviously, blockchain technology and cryptocurrency in some form here to stay. And it is important that those of us, myself included, who kind of eye rolled at the beginning of this whole thing years ago, do start to make sure that we understand how this works. It is so complicated, though, and it really overwhelms me as somebody who's not really a tech literate person in the way that I think you need to be for understanding the ins and outs of blockchain technology.
Well, good luck to you, Erin. Thank you for doing such a great job writing these books. I think, you're helping to address the issue of financial literacy for all Americans, not just those in a certain age group, but we know perhaps the interest is most keen there. We look forward to seeing you in person after this pandemic is over, but thanks so much for being part of our conversation today.
It was wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Hamrick. Until next time, take good care.